All right. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us on the eve of Rare Disease Day. And okay, sorry, I'm just getting a note that one of our panelists can't get here. Can somebody forward Anne the link, please? Just from your thing. Hopefully she'll be able to get in. Sorry about that. The joys of technology. So anyway, we are really, really thrilled to have you with us today. The Inchstone project is truly a passion project for all of us working on it. And we're just so incredibly thrilled to be able to do this collaboratively. It's a really incredible opportunity for the community to come together to work on something that's really going to move us all forward. And we're really excited to share more with you all. If you've heard about it a little bit, we've got some new information. If you haven't heard about it at all, we're going to share a little bit of background. And of course, we welcome anyone who's interested to reach out to us if you want to learn more after. But basically, today, what we're focusing in on is why this work is so important across the DEEs and how we'd love to have you all get involved. So what is the Inchstone project is a question we're going to answer today. How is the Inchstone project working to adapt outcome measures so that they are more suitable for those who are really falling off the scales right now? And this is my son, Elliot, here. You'll see who he's 10 now, but that was him probably when he was about 3 or 4, working on his head control, which he is still working on today. And there are no scales that measure the progress that he has made, but he has made progress. And we really should be able to measure that. And we can't really do that right now. And we want to tell you a little bit about how you can get involved. So I'm so excited that I get to share with you a bit about the team that we have working today. This is our multidisciplinary, multinational, multi-amazing team. And we are really working in this incredibly collaborative way. And we think that we're going to get so much further faster because we're all working in a way that's allowing us to share learnings, compare notes, and build on the work of each other. You know, we're lucky enough to have people who have been doing this work for decades with us, like Ann Berg and Jenny Downs, who are really kind of known as clinical outcome assessment experts in the space. Cher and Ganesh, who have working on an individual measurement tool that is amazing, that you'll hear a little bit more about. Natasha and Mary are psychologists working in clinic with these patients day in, day out. And Becky is an amazing cortical vision impairment specialist who is just going to be a crucial part of our team. And you'll hear a little bit more about that. All right, I'm going to hand it over to you, Cher.
Great, thanks. Just had to get myself off mute. So happy to be a part of this project, and as Gabby said, working together with such an incredible group. So Gabby touched on it with Elliot. What we're here to do is to try to measure not milestones, which are difficult to see in some children who are severely impacted, but the inchstones that they make and the progress that they're making, that we know they're making, but you can't pick up on a lot of different traditional and other outcome measures. So the reason why we think that's really important, to state in addition to the obvious, that it's important, is because in clinical trials, these measurement tools are critical to proving that a drug is working. And unless we have tools like that, 2 things are going to happen. Drugs that are actually promising and interesting, and there seem to be a lot of them now coming to the forefront, those trials that are measuring whether those drugs are working or not are going to fail. And not necessarily because the drug isn't working, but because we have no adequate way to measure whether the drug is working or not. And the second big issue that we all have that I know is really important to this particular group is that even if the drugs are good and we can see that they're working, we can only see that they're working in certain groups. And those groups are the ones that milestones can be measured with traditional outcome measures. And that's certainly not the case in the severe DEEs. And so we want to work very specifically to adapt outcome measures so that we can measure things in this severe DEE population. And what do we mean by that? You know, sometimes you can measure and sometimes you can't measure. Anne Berg, to whom Gabby referred on this call, has done a lot of interesting work in this space. And she came up with this analogy to explain it, which I thought was so clear. Basically, she was talking about supposing you have a baby mouse and you want to measure how much weight the baby mouse is gaining, and you want to use a traditional scale. You put the mouse on your traditional scale. If it can measure me and the weight I'm gaining, then clearly it's not going to pick up the amount of weight a small mouse is gaining. So you have to change the tool. And so you need a different type of scale. You need a scale that's developed for a mouse, and you're going to measure in grams. You're not going to measure in, pounds or kilograms or whatever might be appropriate for somebody like me. So this is the same thing. We just need to change the tool to better measure. And this is really important, not just to us, but also to the people who make these decisions about whether these drugs get to market or not, like the FDA. And recently, the FDA has started to pay attention to this much more closely, measuring from the patient perspective. And they have a series of guidances to tell us what to do and how to measure things and how to develop measures like that, a part of their patient-focused drug development series of guidances. So we are very closely following those to adapt all sorts of outcome measures, which we'll tell you much more about, to try to make sure that we can measure these Inchstones in clinical trials. I'm going to pass it back to Gabby.
Thanks, Cher. That was a great way to introduce that. And for anyone who doesn't know, the Inchstone project is actually a project of Deep Connections, which I think is a little bit more familiar to many folks, which is a cross DEE collaborative project. So how is the Inchstone project working to adapt outcome measures suitable for DEEs? And I think we're gonna start to delve into that here a little bit more, and hopefully it'll give you a picture of how we're doing this. But as we're going through, if you have questions, feel free to throw them into the Q&A, and we'll definitely have time at the end. I'm going to pass it on to Mary.
Thank you. Yeah, and I'd just like to say I'm so excited to be here, really passionate about this work, and grateful to be working with an amazing team. I'm going to spend the next few minutes talking about the work that we've already done, just to lead us up to where we're going next. Since we started, I think we haven't stopped. So we're really excited to share the work that we've done with you already in a short amount of time, and how that moves us forward. I'd like to take just a minute to really acknowledge all of the people who have been a part of this. One of the first things that we did was seek out experts, researchers, clinicians, parents, and then industry partners as well. So here are some of the groups that we're connected with, some of the advisors from the institutions that our advisors and experts on our steering committee are a part of. So we just want to take some time to acknowledge and recognize their involvement in this work. So after assembling our expert team and governance structure, I'm going to talk about a few of the things that we did after that. So in 2021, Deep Connections began digging into what measures existed for the most severely impacted, and finding others who were also doing that same work to measure this progress in this community. So we worked with Combined Brain. We brought them on to do a literature review and began scoping this work with several open workshops. And from that, the Inchstone project was formed. So like I said, once we saw this need, we learned about it and then hit the ground running to try to fill the gap. So the work we've done so far has been about learning and collecting data, identifying specifics, and really gathering information to set the stage for moving forward. One of the things that was really important that we did, and I think Cher already mentioned, the FDA guidances. So we submitted a really detailed response to that guidance document, focused mostly on outcome assessment tools in individuals with DEEs who are severely impacted. Then we realized that we really needed to start assessing individuals with DE and learning about how the tools that we already had worked and thinking about how we could adapt those. So we very quickly developed a pilot study looking at development in individuals with SCN2A, looking at overall development, quality of life, learning about how some of the tools that we are already using work, and also some novel tools and how they could be applied to this population as well. From that work, we submitted 4 late-breaking posters that were accepted at AES, or the American Epilepsy Society, to talk about the preliminary results of that pilot study. Then we at AES also, we had an investigators workshop looking at non-seizure outcome measures in individuals with DE that was incredibly well attended. There was a lot of interest and excitement about the work that we were doing. We also submitted a symposium with further data from the SCN2A pilot study, as well as some other outcome results from preliminary studies. And we submitted that to the Gatlinburg Symposium on developmental disabilities, and that was accepted. And then our next step is we've already submitted a proposal to the Child Neurology Society, looking again at non-seizure outcomes and moving the field forward. So we feel like we've done a lot. We're excited about what we've done, and excited to use this information to further develop appropriate tools for this population.
Thanks, Mary. That's a lot to jam into one slide. So thank you. All right. So Jenny, I'm going to hand it off to you to share a little bit about your results from the pilot we did with the Families SCN2A Foundation.
Yeah, thank you, Gabi. And what Mary outlined just then, there were 2 things that lead on to these 4 posters that you will now see. One was we worked with families at the SCN2A Family Conference last year, directly with families, directly with the children, and it was a really exciting opportunity to collect data. And this informed 3 of the 4 posters. The other one was to do with the same group, but different, a different data set. But we were able to explore the ideas that underpin Inchstone and really start to sort of articulate these in a scientific format and present to the AES. So what you can see on your left is the slide about minimal differences that are important to families. And this was an interview study that was conducted after the evaluations at the conference. And the question to families was, what difference would be important for you if you were entering the usual clinical trials? And what difference would be important to you if you were entering a gene therapy trial where potentially risks would be greater? And this was a narrative approach. It was qualitative interviews, and we found that differences varied by the level of impairment for the child and also the type of trial. And the differences that were meaningful that parents described were not just they needed to learn this skill, but they needed to learn a skill so that they could achieve gains to their quality of life, or the care provided by family and other carers would be easier day to day. So this is a really important stepping stone for our ongoing evaluations of what important differences are to families. And I wonder if I could now pass on to Mary to talk about the next slide, the next poster.
I actually think Natasha is here.
Oh, Natasha, sorry.
I am.
Yeah.
Oh,
So
so cool. So sorry. I looked for you. Yeah.
Sorry, I was a little bit late, everyone, but I'm so excited to be here.
Yes.
So I wanted to talk to you about our poster that we presented looking at the developmental profile 4. So a lot of the tools that we have to measure neurodevelopment at this time are pretty resource heavy. And so the Bailey scales for infant and toddler development is a direct measure of child skills, which takes an hour or even more to get a good assessment of a child's skills. And then another common measure we'll use is the Vineland adaptive behavior scales, which is a pretty intensive interview with families that can take, an hour or sometimes even more. So these tools are very resource heavy. And so there's a newer measure, relatively newer measure, that a lot of clinicians started to use during the pandemic called the Developmental Profile 4. And it's a parent questionnaire that takes about 15 minutes or so to fill out. And so our goal was to see, if this could give us pretty good information that to either complement or serve in lieu of in certain cases where we might be wanting to look at developmental outcomes, for kids who may not be able to come into clinic, or where you have to do repeated assessments to reduce that kind of burden on families as well. And so we wanted to look at how does this DP4, Developmental Profile 4, stand up to our more traditional measures like the Bayley and the Vineland. And we actually found in our sample, it's a very small sample, right? But it's a start of 10 children with SCN2A, we found that the DP4 demonstrated similar initial psychometric properties. So that basically means similar levels of floor effect. It's giving us similar range and variability of scores, which is important when we're thinking about outcome measurement for this population. And so we were really encouraged by our findings. And so we're going to keep looking at the DP4 and how it stacks up compared to our more traditional resource intensive measures like the Bayley and the Vineland. But we're really excited to continue to see, how it performs in other populations as well within the rare disease space. So yes, encouraging. And so now I'll pass it off to Cher, who will talk about her work.
Hi, so with us, our team focuses on an individualized outcome measure, which just means that it's very tailored to each individual person rather than a standard measure where the questions are all the same for each individual. And that's called goal attainment scaling. So I'm not sure if everyone's familiar with it, but it's a method that involves sitting down with a clinician and a family to set goals for treatment. And then once the goals are set and quantitative scales are developed for those goals, then over time, you check back in to see how people are doing, making progress against those goals. And they're able to rate their attainment, whether they actually achieved the goal, did better than the goal, or worse than the goal. And you can see in a population like the severe DEEs, how important that is. You can set the goal that's tailored to your individual child. You don't necessarily have to set a goal that's the same for each person. So we wanted to try, we've been working in this across a whole bunch of different disease areas. And this was our first time working in SCN2A associated issues. So this was, again, like other people, a real pilot that we had the opportunity to try with the same 10 families who had been interviewed and participated in the other parts of the study. And so for us, we had the clinicians sit down with the families to set goals for treatment. 10 families participated, and they each set 3 goals. There was no active treatment, so it was just a pilot to see how well received this methodology would be, both by the clinicians doing the goal attainment scaling interview and also by the families participating. So we got a total of 30 goals for the families across the 10 families, which was excellent. And we also saw that it took about an hour to do the goal setting interview, so it's quite intensive to set it up. We did a follow-up 1 month after the pilot ended and after the SCN2A conference, or about there between 1 and 3 months later. And that took about 15 or 20 minutes to complete that follow-up interview. The interesting thing, we didn't want to spend a lot of time on the actual data because it was mostly a pilot to see how well it would work. And it was very well received both by the clinicians and the families, who really felt heard and were excited to be able to express what was important to them through goals that were meaningful to them, but also meaningful to the clinician. So that was excellent. But it was also very interesting, of course, to see what kinds of goals were set. So of the 30 goals that were set, at least a third of them were actually set in something related to communication, which was really informative for us already to see what was important to this small group of families. Then we had a variety of other goals that were set for around eating, toileting, mobility, sleep, dressing, difficulty transitioning, anxiety and stress. And one person, but only one of the 30 goals was set around seizures, which I think is one of the things we wanted to highlight at the beginning. A lot of the measures that are used in clinical trials focus only on that as the most important outcome. But even in this tiny little pilot, we were able to see that wasn't the most important outcome for these families. So like Natasha, we really are looking forward to taking this to the next level. And you'll hear more about our plans for 2023, how we want to expand our individual goal attainment scaling study and the other studies. And then I'm excited to start comparing our goal attainment scaling data and what we learned from goal attainment scaling compared to what we learned from the other outcomes. So we can see how the outcomes can all be coordinated together as a kind of a battery of instruments to measure change in this group. So I'm going to pass it over to Anne to talk about her work.
There we go. Thanks, Cher. So the fourth poster that I'm going to just introduce briefly is based on the SCN2A clinical trial readiness study. All 10 children who are in the SCN2A Inchstone pilot came from the clinical trials readiness study. And this is a study that's been going on for 2 years. We just finished data collection and we're just finishing the final cleaning and getting ready to do the analysis. But this was a study designed with the family group, with greatly informed by the families, looking at the overall characteristics of children with SCN2A related disorders, and with a real focus on what kind of measures and what kind of outcomes and how do we measure them, just as critical to the Inchstone project. The role of the Inchstone project in this was really to get us focused in on what the most important things were to families. And while Cher mentioned a third of the goals were related to communication, 9 out of 10 families had a communication goal. So that was clearly a really critical issue. And we have several measures in our study looking at communication. And one of the instruments that we used, and you heard Natasha mention it, is the Vineland-3. And I don't know if you can appreciate it in this slide, but in the 5th panel on the top right, you can see the typical standardized scores. Top right, no, just to the right there. Yep, there you go. So the left half of that shows you the typical standardized scores that we always get, and they're right down at the bottom, which is kind of useless. It's like what Cher said, you put your little baby mouse on the bathroom scale and you get nothing. But then if we use an alternative form of scoring called the growth scale values, it's like putting your little mouse now on a scale that can measure in grams and milligrams, and you can start to see the actual variation in this group. They're not at the bottom. They do have skills, and we can measure if they drop. We can especially measure if they go up. So that was a really exciting piece of this work, and that's moving forward now into a paper. So I think our next person is Gabi. Are you? Oh no, Jenny. I'm sorry. Back to Jenny.
Thank you. So this has been really formative. Our first year has been us becoming a very strong group together, very clear about what our mission and our goals are, and particularly informed by the pilot study at the SCN2A Family Conference. It was direct contact with families and children, and it really illustrated all of the points we wanted to pull together for better measurement for these children. And so we have now a design for our activities in 2023. And here there are 4 main areas. And what the first top left quadrant of the slide is about consultation. And this is what we particularly want to talk today about, which is a survey of families to understand non-seizure outcomes that are most important for those children and young people with DEEs and their families. And this is wide-ranging to sort of find from a large group of families and conditions what those most important outcomes are. So we will come to that soon. But what I will also point out is that we also have plans for an expanded clinical evaluation study, larger than the pilot study, and that's the second top quadrant test. We aim to recruit approximately 50 families with a child with a severe DEE and really look at expand the activities we did at the pilot study so that we can be more powerful with our analyses because we will have a larger group of children. And so that's a feasibility study, and it will really inform how the instruments are adapted and to this particular group. The bottom left quadrant is validate. These changes, any validation, whether we adopt a scale as it is or whether we adapt a scale to be more bespoke for children with severe impairments, it will need testing, field testing, and that's the validation component, and that will continue over time. It will start in 2023, but that will continue over time. And then the fourth quadrant, the bottom right, is disseminate. We aim to engage with a wide range of stakeholders in this field. That's patient advocacy group, families themselves, the pharmaceutical industry, the regulators and academics and clinicians to really maximize our impact. So not only our impact, but it maximizes the ideas that come into what we do. So we want to build our ideas as richly as possible, but then disseminate those ideas so that they're really known by who needs to know them to affect the children on the ground. I think I'll hand over to Anne to focus on the consultation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jenny. If we go back to the FDA, they have a large number of guidances about how to go about identifying the concept of interest, how to go about measuring the concept of interest, and how to go about using that concept of interest to, or the measurement of that concept as a trial endpoint. But the first thing starts with the families, and the natural history guidances from 2019, which are still in draft form, really emphasize the importance of focusing in on aspects of the disease that are important to the families or patients and caregivers in this case. And those are things that are life-altering and life-limiting. Now, the group of us here, I have to say, and I don't want to, I just want to say, we've had a lot of experience doing this among all of us. And I'm really fortunate to be working with this extraordinary group. And we have done this in many different formats, in many different ways. And we've been paying very close attention to the FDA guidances. And the guidances really emphasize that there are many ways to approach this problem. They just need to be appropriate and they need to be evidence-based. And you need to provide evidence to go on to the next stage. So the first thing that we're doing is following through on the first two guidances and gaining further information from families about what is most important. And that is a survey that we're hoping to get out fairly soon, within the next month and a half. Yeah, I think we could advance to the next slide. And it's a survey, for those of you who know Jerry Nesbitt, is a survey that will be, forgot about that, a survey that will be disseminated in clearings. These are the guidances. I'm sorry, I already talked about them, but the first two are how do you get good representative input, and then what to ask and why. So if we go on, that's what we're going to be focusing on this survey. We're looking for broad participation across several groups of DEEs. This is really critical that we get as many as possible. And while we are really focused on those who are most profoundly impaired, because that's where the measurement is most difficult, we do want a full range. And that's really critical because we don't want to have different instruments. We have rare diseases, and we need instruments that can cover the full range of ability and impairment for any one disease. If we have multiple instruments, those, one instrument for the most severely impaired and another one for those who have some function, the statistical and other design issues get very complicated, and ultimately we're only dealing with small sample sizes, so one instrument is really recommended. But in doing this, we really want to find out, what should we be focusing on? What are the most life-altering, life-limiting features of these diseases that are common across each disease? Because if it only affects a small group, that's going to be very hard to justify as the most life-limiting and life-altering outcome. The types of outcomes that we're looking at are engagement or cognition. Is my child even aware that I'm there? Does he know who I am? Communication. Communication, as we've already mentioned, came out in the GAS survey. It has come out repeatedly in one study after another after another. It's what makes us sentient creatures, and not just humans. I mean, all sentient creatures communicate. It's critical. And then, ultimately, the sort of integrator of all this is quality of life. What is quality of life in these families, in these young people, and how can it be changed by improving these other outcomes? If we go to the next slide. So the survey that we're planning, and I mentioned it will be in clearings. Jerry Nesbitt is, I think, on the call today, so I just wanted to call out for him, is going to start with simply telling us, what does your child have and where do you live? Because we're interested in representation around the world. And we're starting with a very simple assessment of level of function. And this is based on a series of surveys that I have been doing already that have involved hundreds at this point of families of children who have different DEEs. They've worked very well. They're very well grounded in the rehabilitation literature. So we're going to start with that. And then we are going to systematize Jenny, who is one of the most extraordinary qualitative interviewers I have had the pleasure of listening. She let me sit in on some of her interviews, and I learned so much. She's amazing. So learning from her, we developed some questions that, well, it doesn't replace Jenny. It tries to emulate as much as possible what it might be like to take a survey from Jenny. So we have a series of questions that get at that. We also are asking, just as Jenny did, what would be a change for you? Where is your child now, and what would you tell us was better? What would we look for? Try to be as subjective as possible. And I could give you specific examples of that, but I think you generally understand what I'm trying to get at. We are including in the survey the quality of life, the QI disability interview as part of the package, as well as the DP4, that's the formal neuropsychological assessment. We have it on 10 patients. We're going to get it on, we hope, a few hundred. In addition, Natasha and Mary trialed some rehabilitation measures for cognition that are generally used in the ICU for people who are recovering from coma, but they really get at that very initial piece of cognition, awareness, being able to react to things going on around oneself. And then we're working very closely with Becky on a modified version of the CVI that could be used in a survey. It will never replace a full clinical interview, but we're hoping it will get us several steps towards understanding CVI based on a standardized structured interview. And I think from there we go on to Gabby.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, we're really looking, as you've heard the team highlight, to engage a wide swath of the DEE community in this, so we really can get some representative data. So, we are hoping that we will be able to work with patient advocacy group leaders to do announcements through their family groups. And of course, we'll be pushing this out through our other networks, such as Deep Connections, the Rare Epilepsy Network, and other groups like that. As Anne mentioned, we're hoping to get started in the next month or so. We are hoping to enroll about 250 caregivers of a range of families, and really hoping to get a good stream of those who are more severely impacted, because we've never really had a lot of data on them, and we'd like to start gathering that. You know, why should you participate? I mean, I think we've started to try to kind of dig into this, but as individuals, you have the opportunity to help ensure that children of every ability are able to be included in clinical trials, which is not really the case right now, because there's less inclination to have those kids be a part of trials, because you can't really measure what's happening with them with tools like the global impression of change, right? And traditional things like elements of the violin that's traditionally scored, those kinds of things. We will make gift cards available. It's not always a driver, but we do want to thank families for their time. As a caregiver, I know that we get a lot of surveys sent around, and it's hard to take the time to do that, but this is one that we hope will help us really start to set a standard for how we can have more inclusive trials that really start to give access to a wider community of our children. For community leaders, we'd be happy to provide co-branded materials so that your community can see this is something that you're behind and you're supporting and wanting to help your community engage in. And ultimately, we believe that involvement can really increase the potential that FDA will see these tools as applicable for your community, right? So, you know, this will be something that if your community has an emerging trial coming, and they see that you have been involved in this kind of research, that this is something that could work for your community. And we absolutely encourage you, if you have emerging trials that are coming, and you are working with a pharma company that doesn't really think about this, you know, tell them to reach out to us and get involved with us, because we would love to be able to make sure that they have tools that can capture your community. And of course, we are going to share these results back. You know, we'll do future webinars. We'll share in multiple ways. And for groups that have more than 20 participants, we will do individualized reports for you so you can better understand how your community reported out. And then any group that participates at all with any participation, will share the results, of course. So really, you know, ultimately we want to say is that each individual caregiver has the ability to play a role here. I know sometimes we feel very powerless and like we don't have the capacity to make a difference. This really is a way where families can contribute and help build a better future for all of our kids, so that we can really find better treatments for our children and not have them end up on the cutting room floor, which we have seen, because they couldn't really measure anything beyond seizures. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing, open it up for Q&A. I know Mary's in the middle of a tornado warning, so she's off camera, but she's around. So I know that we can start with the question that Isa had. Do you think the seizure outcomes were truly not important, or do you think that families have given up on it, or that they knew that you were looking for secondary measures? So I don't know, Cher, if you want to talk a little bit about how the question was put out there.
That's an excellent question. And the truth is, I have no idea. We only had 10 families, and the way a goal attainment scaling interview is structured, and Jenny could talk about her open-ended, more qualitative interviews are structured. In the goal attainment scaling one, you ask the caregiver to really hone in on what they would see as something meaningful to try to improve for their child and what is important to them. And the whole purpose of it is that there may be 30 things wrong or 50 things wrong or 12 things wrong, but you're really supposed to focus on the top few that you'd really like to see impacted by treatment. And so that's the way the conversation is structured. So presumably, if you just take it at face value, then 29 of the 30 responses sort of indicated that seizures weren't as important to them as something else. However, we don't know if that's because, like you say, families have given up, or in this case, we didn't have a treatment or a therapeutic intervention. It's just a pilot to see how we would do these types of interviews and whether people would find them meaningful and useful to think about. And so knowing there was no specific treatment attached to it may very well have influenced responses. So I'm not sure about that from the goal attainment scaling perspective. Maybe others can answer on behalf of the other tools.
I think I would add here that the conditions that the children have are very complex, and they all play a role in influencing day-to-day how those children are living. And we can't say that seizures are not important, they are important, but we're wanting to draw attention to the other factors that really play important roles in how the children live and behave and experience life. And so finding that place where we can properly understand what's important to the children is it's really important that we open out that narrative to include non-seizure outcomes. Seizures have had a lot of attention. That's right, because they are medically very important to manage, but we need to build this a gestalt of assessments to properly reflect the child's living. So we feel that's something that we can address.
Yeah, I would just add, there were children who did not have seizures in that group. And there were children who had seizures in the past, but were no longer having them or were well controlled. So those were not the main issues. And this was also limited to families that could travel. So there may have been some bias or self-selection in who was there.
Mhm.
I could see that having happened.
Yeah, and I'm not sure that it's an indication that seizures were not as much of a problem for any of them, but I think it's in this case it was what was raising, really I think the questions were framed in is like, what is most important to you? Like, what would you like to see change that could improve quality of life? So I think there's a lot of complexity to it, but hopefully, we'll continue to tease that out as we keep working. That's a great question. And how long will the survey take for families to fill out?
Right. That's important. Tracy knows I do long surveys sometimes. We're trying to make this shorter. The survey should be in two components, two parts. The first part between 20 and 30 minutes, and the second part maybe 30 to 40 minutes. We are going to file it with a couple parents and just make sure that we're, excuse me, estimating that correctly, but this is not going to be an hours and hours long process.
Mm-hmm. And Kate was asking if we could share the Inchstone, if the Inchstone project could be, video could be shared. Absolutely. Take it and run with it, share it anywhere and everywhere. That was really made to try to start building support for this kind of work. And, we would love to have that be out there as a tool to help raise awareness about why this kind of work is really important. Thank God, Tracy says, yeah, I know. Oh my gosh, I know we're so exhausted. We're tired of surveys, but hopefully it'll be an impactful one. So Sarah, will there be a way to push the data back to our own database, patient database? That's a great question, Sarah, in terms of how this data can be shared, and can we share it back with PAGs in a way that they can integrate it in their own databases?
That's a wonderful question. And I'm so glad that Jerry Nesbitt is on the call, because Jerry has a way to do that. And it's called the Clinical Research ID, or CRID. And it's something that the individual, the parent in this case, creates. It is your number. And it's like a password that you give investigators and say, here is my password. It's kind of, if you've ever used MyChart, it's like using MyChart and then using MyChart anywhere, where you can let other physicians or other providers into your medical record. It's a way of doing that, to allow you to give access to other people to your data. So yes, we can do that. And it does require you, the individual, to go and get a clinical research ID. That will be something available through the survey. There'll be a link, you can go do it. And then once you do it, you can link your data from this survey to your data from another survey. We can't do it on block because those are confidential data, but you as an individual can say, I will share my confidential data with you, and you can do that.
Mhm. It's a great question to think about how to build that in. How long until the results are shared back with the PAGs do we estimate?
As soon as possible. I hope that we get this off towards the end of March, to somewhere end of March, early April. We haven't quite decided. We have to see how quickly we get people participating. But if we can get robust participation and meet our mark within 1 to 2 months, we can turn that around fairly quickly. And quickly, I would say, would be 1 to 2 months. So it might not be until late summer, early fall. Wait, if we do April to June, yeah, late summer.
Mhm. Although some elements of it require intense analysis. I'm thinking about the data we got from 10 kids, right? And there's still data that we're trying to dig into. So not all of it would probably be, I mean, Natasha, you can speak to that, the mountains of data you have on 10 kids, but yeah.
No, not all of it, but some basic, the data that are more quantified, we can certainly do summaries of. For example, we can ask questions in children who cannot walk, cannot talk, who are fed by G-tube, who have no hand use. What do parents prioritize as the top thing that they'd like to work on or see improve? We can ask those kinds of questions, and we can ask, does that seem to vary by the groups? When we have at least 20 or 30 from a group, a good reason to get a lot of people from your individual group to participate, so we can look at that. We can start to ask, does that vary by group? We will get a little bit of information about epilepsy. Does that vary by whether or not the child has active seizures right now or not? So we can do some very simple things like that, which have a huge impact.
Great. And Caitlin was asking, how receptive are pharma companies to getting this on a case report form? Any thoughts?
To getting the survey itself on a case report form, I'm not sure that they would use our survey on a case report form in a trial. The survey is intended to identify the levels of impairment, the priorities of patients, of parents, get a little bit more about what meaningful difference looks like, and then to trial in this larger sample some of the measures that we trialed in Columbus. What the pharma companies need for a case report form are some really good clinical outcome assessments, and that's what we're drilling into. So I think it's not so much if they want to do it, it's what the FDA is going to say will be an effective clinical outcomes assessment. And so once we have an effective clinical outcomes assessment, they will have those on case report forms.
Yeah. All right. Well, feel free to keep dropping questions in the Q&A or the chat. Does anyone, did we miss anything that anyone else wants to chime in on? We've got a few minutes. Jenny or Anne, I mean, you guys have been doing this work. I'm not trying to age you because you guys look young and beautiful, but for a long time, like what brings you hope about doing work in this way? Like, what do you think? What do you hope for? We're aiming for 5 years. So Jenny, what do you think?
I think my sort of goal is, or my great sense of satisfaction for working in this idea of measurement for children with severe impairments, is that parents want authenticity. They want their child correctly acknowledged for the need they have, and also for the things that they can do. And it's really critical to go to the child to have authenticity in how those children are measured, and then that just that gives true knowledge, and that can influence parents themselves, every single therapist and caregiver, and going into trials. It's the biggest thing that is really holding back our clinical trial readiness. We have wonderful communities. We have important clinical trial sites where there's growing experience in running clinical trials to have multi-site studies. And we have new developments in the treatment sphere, but we're still sitting with old style measurements, and we really need authenticity to come to the children. And every time I talk to families about that, they share that. I hear that they share that with me, and that is so exciting, because authenticity is a great truth. That's me.
Yeah, I would echo everything Jenny said. And I have to say, I came to this through the epilepsy silo, the symptom silo of seizures. And when I started off, everything was seizures, everything was seizures. And then there was all this other stuff. And I watched, I mean, back in the 80s and 90s, I watched these poor parents taking their kids to clinic and being told, no, he's never going to do anything, he's going to, let's just take care of the seizures. The kids were toxic on 5 or 6 medications, and nothing was getting better. And with the advent of the potential for precision medicine, mostly with genetic diagnosis and an understanding of the underlying molecular mechanisms of these developmental disorders, that's now changed. And I just think it is so exciting to see. And I also want to mention the rise of the internet has changed things, because families are now driving the discussion. And that's explicitly acknowledged now in our law. The 21st Century Cures Act and the patient-focused drug development guidances are all about the patient's perspective. So I just find it really fascinating to see this group that has long been ignored, patients in general, but the DEE, the neurodevelopmental disorder group in general, has long just been ignored and shifted off someplace else, really taking center stage and driving this. And it's really exciting for me.
Yeah.
And hopeful.
We had a question from Tracy about stratifying by age, families, with older kids might have different expectations. So that's a great question. Yeah.
Oh, it's a beautiful question. And Tracy's lived this. And yes, of course, we will have age. And some of the questions we ask are actually more appropriate to some age groups than others. So I'm keenly aware of and appreciative. We all are, of that importance.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I totally agree. And that's a part of the reason for a very wide sample, so that we can understand priorities by age, by impairment, and things like that, because life changes as you grow older, as it does for all of us. And we really need to be authentic to that as well.
Yeah,
I agree, Anne.
Yeah, and I think for those of us who have older kids, and I know Tracy, you've got a 30-year-old now, right? I think it really does. We need to be able to say that families who've got kids who have, sustained extensive damage, probably have a very different expectation, and qualify that, because that's going to be, critical when we're thinking about trials too. It's like those kids still deserve to have, change, and meaningful component. You're not old. You still look younger than me, Tracy, somehow. So Bina was asking if we can report back Pat per disease. Yeah, basically, Bina, we said that anyone whose disorder has 20 or more participants, we will give you data specifically on your disorder broken out. But every group will get the whole complete set to understand. So any final thoughts from our panel here? I don't see any other questions come in. That doesn't mean, of course, you can't find us anywhere and everywhere. Feel free to, reach out with us anytime. I think everybody knows how to find us. I'm going to put my email in here, and people can reach out to us if you have questions, if you want to recap, if you want to hash out how your community can get involved. I think that, we are just really grateful that all of you showed up here. I know there's people who are going to be watching later because they couldn't make it live, but we think that this is such an incredibly important opportunity for our community, our DEE community, to come together to speak in a unified voice. And it's not going to be all the same things, right? But in a unified voice about, that we are a community that has a lot of needs, and they need to keep listening to us and understand that, we have priorities. Some of them are seizure related and some of them are not. And I think, the more broad participation we can see among a wide swath of DEEs, the FDA will be able to see the wide representation, and then these tools will be really seen as something that could be used in each of your disorders as trials are starting to come, and we know that there's more rapid advancement. So with that, I think we can close it out. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. We are really, really excited about this work, and we look forward to sharing more with you as the survey nears. We will definitely be reaching out to you. Don't worry. You will all get emails from us, probably from multiple directions. But in the meantime, if you have questions or thoughts, please feel free to reach out to us, any one of us, frankly, and we'll set up a time to chat. So happy Rare Disease Days to everyone. Take care, and we'll see you soon.
Bye.